No one warned her. Not about the iron gates. Not about the armed guards. And definitely not about the 3 children who had driven every nanny away screaming. They said no woman lasted more than 48 hours inside the Blackwood estate. Some quit crying. Some ran for their lives. One never even came back for her paycheck. When a broke single mother with $57 to her name stepped through those gates. Everyone assumed she'd be gone by morning. What no one expected was that the most dangerous man on the East Coast would lose control of his house, his enemies, and eventually his heart because of one woman who walked in with nothing to lose. And it all started the moment she rang the bell. 3 women had already quit the Blackwood estate in less than 10 days. One left sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Another stormed out, threatening lawyers and cameras. The third ran so fast she didn't even bother grabbing her coat. Everyone in the city said the same thing. Alexander Blackwood was a devil in a tailored suit, a crime lord who quietly controlled half of the East Coast. But those who worked inside the mansion whispered something far more terrifying. It wasn't Alexander who drove the nannies away, it was his children. His 3 6-year-old twins were described as uncontrollable, vicious, and emotionally shattered. No one lasted more than 48 hours. Then came Lena Hart, a struggling single mother with just $57 left in her checking account, a past full of loss, and absolutely nothing left to protect her from failure. She didn't know she was stepping into a battlefield. She didn't know she was already being watched. And she definitely didn't know that a simple homemade breakfast and one quiet song would change the future of one of the most feared families in the city. Lena stood in front of the towering iron gates of the Blackwood estate, rain soaking through her thin blazer and dripping into her shoes. The rideshare driver hadn't even waited. He dropped her at the curb, muttered, "Good luck," crossed himself, and sped away. Lena tightened her grip on her beat-up suitcase until her fingers ached. "Just do this for Emma," she whispered to herself. "Get the job. Get the money." Her daughter was sleeping on a neighbor's couch. Lena had exactly 2 days to secure this position and the advance payment, or they'd be evicted. She pressed the intercom. "Name," a rough voice snapped. "Lena Hart. I'm here from the agency, for the child care position." A long pause, then a loud buzz. The gates creaked open. The walk up the driveway felt endless. Perfect hedges, cold stone statues, armed guards pacing silently. This wasn't a home. It was a fortress. Lena grew up in a rough neighborhood. She knew the difference between private security and organized crime muscle. This was the second one. Before she could knock, the massive front door flew open, and a porcelain vase exploded against the wall inches from her head. "I hate you. Go away." A child's scream echoed through the hall. Fragments shattered at her feet. Lena didn't scream, didn't flinch. She calmly brushed a piece of ceramic off her shoulder and looked up. At the top of the grand staircase stood 3 identical boys. Dark curls, sharp eyes, faces hardened far beyond their age. The Blackwood triplets. "Nice throw," Lena called up evenly. "But if you're trying to scare me, you're gonna need better aim than that." The boys froze. They were used to fear, used to tears. They were not used to a soaked woman in a discount suit critiquing their technique. "Enough." The single word sliced through the room. Lena turned. A man stepped out of the shadows, tall, broad, controlled. He looked like someone carved from stone and violence. Alexander Blackwood. He was bigger than the headline suggested, his presence heavy and suffocating. A tailored dark suit. Cold, unreadable eyes. "You're late," he said flatly. "You're throwing furniture," Lena replied, lifting her chin. He studied her for a long moment, like a predator deciding whether something was worth killing. "Follow me." No handshake. No apology. Just the faint scent of expensive liquor and gun oil as he turned away. Inside his office, Alexander sat behind a massive desk without even glancing at her resume. "You're desperate," he said calmly. "Single. 1 child. Facing eviction. That makes you dangerous." "It makes me determined," Lena answered. "You need someone who won't run." "I need a paycheck." His gaze sharpened. "My sons are grieving," he said. "And angry. 5 nannies this month. The last lasted 6 hours." He leaned forward. "Stay 48 hours, and I erase your debts. Leave early, you get nothing." Lena's heart pounded. She thought of her daughter. "Deal," she said quietly. "But I work my way. No guards in the nursery." Alexander's lips twitched, amusement or warning. You have until Monday morning, he said. Try not to die. Lena didn't get a welcome tour. She didn't get instructions. She didn't even get a chance to set her suitcase down. The moment Alexander Blackwood left the room, the triplets attacked. One chair tipped over behind her. A toy truck slammed into the wall near her head. Another vase shattered, on purpose. The boys spread out like a trained unit. One blocked the door. One climbed onto the banister. The third stared at her with eyes far too calm for a child. You won't last, the tallest one said flatly. They all cry. Lena slowly removed her soaked blazer and folded it over a chair. No, she replied calmly. They quit. That answer confused them. Most adults begged. Most shouted. She did neither. Instead, she walked past them, straight toward the kitchen. The triplets followed. Silently. Like hunters. The Blackwood kitchen was massive. Stainless steel. Perfectly clean. Untouched. No cereal boxes. No juice cartons. No kid food anywhere. Lena opened the fridge and frowned. Figures, she muttered. She grabbed eggs, bread, milk, and apples, lit the stove, started cooking. The boys watched in disbelief. You're not supposed to touch anything, one warned. Lena cracked eggs with practiced ease. Then stop me. None of them did. The smell of warm butter and cinnamon slowly filled the air. 10 minutes later, Lena placed 3 plates on the counter. French toast. Apple slices shaped like stars. Warm milk with honey. No yelling. No threats. Just food. The smallest boy scoffed. We don't eat Nanny food. Lena shrugged. Cool. Then it's mine. She took a bite. Chewed slowly. Silence. Their stomachs betrayed them. First. One plate disappeared. Then another. The third boy hesitated, then grabbed his fork angrily. No one spoke. After breakfast, Lena wiped her hands and knelt down to eye level. House rules, she said evenly. 1. You don't throw things at people. 2. If you're angry, say why. 3. Nobody sleeps alone in this house. That last rule froze them. You don't get to decide that, one snapped. Lena's voice softened. Your mother used to sing to you at night. The air shifted instantly. How do you know that? The middle boy whispered. I can't hear it, Lena said. In the way you slam doors. In the way you don't sleep. She stood. I'll be in the kitchen if you want seconds. And if you don't, that's fine too. She walked away. No pressure. No fear. Up on the second-floor balcony, unseen by anyone, Alexander Blackwood watched everything. The food untouched for months. The silence. The way his sons didn't destroy a single object. For the first time since his wife died, the house felt alive. Later that night, when the storms rolled in and thunder shook the windows, Lena heard quiet footsteps outside the guest room. One boy, then another, then the third. They didn't speak. They just sat on the floor. Lena pulled a blanket over them and, without thinking, began to hum. A soft tune. Low. Broken. Familiar. The boys' shoulders slowly relaxed. One of them whispered, barely audible. She used to sing that. Alexander stood in the dark hallway, fists clenched. His sons were asleep. And the woman he hired as a last resort had done the impossible. But what Lena didn't know was that someone else in the house had noticed her too. And not everyone was happy she survived the first night. Lena didn't sleep that night. Not because the triplets cried. They didn't. Not because of fear. She'd lived with worse. It was the silence that kept her awake. A house this big should never be this quiet. At 3:17 a.m., Lena heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Not the soft padding of children. Someone was walking the hallway outside the nursery. Lena slipped out of bed, heart pounding, and cracked the door open just enough to see a man in a security uniform standing by the nursery door. He wasn't checking on the boys. He was listening. Lena froze. Most guards avoided the children. They hated the screaming. This one didn't flinch. The guard finally turned and walked away, disappearing down the east wing. Lena closed the door quietly. Something was wrong. The next morning, the Blackwood estate was buzzing. Staff whispered. Phones rang nonstop. Armed men moved faster than usual. Alexander Blackwood stood in the dining room, reading something on his tablet, jaw tight. The Salerno family canceled the meeting, his right-hand man muttered. No explanation. Alexander's eyes darkened. They're testing me. Lena entered with the triplets trailing behind her. For the first time, the boy sat at the table without flipping plates or screaming. Alexander noticed. He noticed everything. They eat now? He asked calmly. They do, Lena replied. When they feel safe. That answer lingered longer than expected. Alexander dismissed the staff with a single look. Soon, it was just him, Lena, and the boys. Why are you still here? He asked her bluntly. Because I said I would be, Lena answered. And because they need consistency. One of the boys reached for her hand. Alexander's expression flickered. Anger, grief, something close to pain. You realize, he said slowly, that people will use my children to get to me. Lena met his gaze. Then you'd better stop letting the wrong people near them. The words hit harder than a threat. That afternoon, Lena discovered something she wasn't supposed to. While folding clothes in the nursery, she found a phone taped beneath the dresser, not a toy. Not old. Active. It buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. She's still here. That's a problem. Lena's blood ran cold. Another message followed. The kids are softening. Orders? Lena dropped the phone like it burned her. Someone inside the house was leaking information, and worse. They were watching the children. She didn't confront anyone. Instead, she watched. She paid attention to who lingered too long, who asked too many questions, who avoided Alexander's eyes. The same guard from the night before avoided her gaze. And when the triplets fell asleep during afternoon reading time, Lena felt a presence behind her. You shouldn't touch things that aren't yours, a voice murmured. She turned. It was the guard. Up close, his smile didn't reach his eyes. You've gotten very comfortable here, he said softly. Comfort makes people careless. Lena straightened. I'm just doing my job. The guard leaned closer. For your sake, he whispered. Don't get attached to children who won't be here much longer. That night, Lena locked the nursery door. She sat on the floor between the beds, fully dressed, listening to the rain hit the windows, for the first time since taking the job. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for them. And somewhere deep inside the Blackwood estate, plans were already moving. Because Lena Hart was never supposed to last past 48 hours. And now? Someone had decided to fix that. The warning came too late. At 11:42 p.m., the power went out. Not just the lights. The security cameras, the alarms, the entire east wing went dark. The Blackwood estate fell into silence. Then the screaming started. Lena was already moving. She scooped the triplets out of their beds, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. One boy clung to her neck. Another buried his face in her shoulder. Quiet, she whispered. I've got you. All of you. Gunshots echoed from somewhere downstairs. Not loud. Controlled, professional. Lena knew then, this wasn't a robbery. This was a retrieval. She locked the nursery door, dragged the heavy dresser across it, and pulled the boys into the hidden closet behind the wardrobe, the one she'd found by accident days earlier. Listen to me, she whispered urgently. No matter what you hear, you do not open this door. Not for anyone. Not even your father. The boy's eyes widened. But, one started. Lena pressed her forehead to his. I promise. I will come back. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. A voice hissed into a radio. They're not here. The doorknob rattled violently. The dresser shook. One of the boys whimpered. Lena stood. She stepped out of the closet and quietly closed the wardrobe door behind her. Alone, she grabbed the fireplace poker and positioned herself by the door. The lock snapped. The door burst open. The guard stepped inside. The same one. His gun was raised. You should have left, he said calmly. Lena swung first. The poker slammed into his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. He cursed, lunging. They crashed into the wall. Lena's back hit hard, pain exploding through her spine, but she didn't let go. She screamed. Not in fear, in rage. She slammed the poker into his knee. Bone cracked. The man went down. Before he could recover, Lena grabbed the gun and backed away, shaking. Don't move, she warned. His smile was bloody. You think Blackwood survives tonight? He sneered. You think those kids do? A single gunshot answered him. The man collapsed. Alexander Blackwood stood in the doorway, smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol. His suit was torn. Blood stained his sleeve, not his. He looked at Lena. Really looked. And for the first time, fear flickered across his face. Where are my sons? Lena turned and opened the wardrobe. Three small bodies launched themselves into Alexander's arms. The man who ruled cities dropped to his knees, holding them like they were air. An hour later, the estate was locked down. Bodies were removed. Phones were destroyed. Names were erased. Alexander stood in his office while Lena cleaned blood off her hands in the sink. You disobeyed my rules, he said quietly. You fought my men. You endangered yourself. Lena turned. And you hired a traitor, she shot back. One who planned to sell your children. Silence. Alexander didn't argue. Because she was right. You should leave, he said finally. Tonight. With money. With protection. Lena shook her head. They won't stop, she said. And those boys, they won't survive losing another mother figure. The word hit him like a bullet. Mother. Alexander looked away. You stay, he said after a long pause. But from now on, this house runs differently. How? Lena asked. He met her eyes. From now on, he said, anyone who threatens my children answers to you first. And somewhere far away, a rival boss received the news. The Blackwood triplets were no longer unguarded. They were protected by a woman with nothing left to lose. And that made her more dangerous than any weapon. The city changed its tone overnight. Alexander Blackwood didn't announce what happened at the estate. He didn't need to. By morning, 3 rival operations had gone dark. 2 warehouses burned. One trusted lieutenant from the Salerno family vanished without a trace. Everyone understood the message. The line had been crossed. Inside the Blackwood estate, however, things were strangely quiet. Lena sat at the kitchen table helping the triplets with breakfast, the same way she had the first day. Toast, eggs, cut fruit. No chaos, just calm. Alexander watched from the doorway, unnoticed. They listen to you, his right-hand man muttered beside him. They fear no one else. They don't fear her either, Alexander replied. They trust her. That realization unsettled him more than any threat. Later that afternoon, Alexander called Lena into his office. The door locked behind her. On the desk lay a thin black folder. Before you came here, Alexander said evenly. You worked 2 jobs. One legal, one not. Lena didn't react. You didn't just drop out of nursing school, he continued. You were recruited. Emergency trauma response. Off the books. High-risk environments. He slid the folder toward her. Photos. Dates. Locations. She recognized every one. I walked away, Lena said quietly. You survived, Alexander corrected. Most don't. He leaned back. That night, you didn't fight like a nanny. You fought like someone trained to protect assets. Silence stretched. Lena finally spoke. I won't hurt people for you. Alexander nodded once. I already know. He stood. But I need someone who understands danger. Someone my enemies won't see coming. He paused. Someone my children already see as family. Lena's throat tightened. What are you asking? Alexander opened a second folder. Inside was a new identity. New accounts. A legal guardianship framework. If anything happens to me, he said calmly, you take them. Legally. Permanently. The words crushed the air from her lungs. You're asking me to become their mother, she whispered. No, Alexander said. I'm asking you to be their shield. That night, Lena sat on the nursery floor as the triplets slept. One clutched her sleeve. Another had his foot hooked over her ankle. The smallest murmured in his sleep. Don't go. Lena closed her eyes. She had come for money. For survival. Somehow, she had become something far more dangerous. Someone people would kill to remove. Someone people would die to protect. Downstairs, Alexander stood alone, staring at a photo of his late wife. They chose her, he said softly to the empty room. So did I. Far across the city, a phone buzzed in a dark office. She's still alive, a voice said. And now she's untouchable. A pause. Then a cold reply. Then we don't remove her. We break her. They didn't come for Lena with guns. They came for her past. It started with a phone call at 6:08 a.m. Lena was packing the triplets' lunches when the phone rang, an unlisted number. She almost ignored it. Almost. Ms. Hart, a man's voice said calmly. We found your daughter. The knife hit instantly. Lena's hand tightened around the counter. You don't know what you're talking about. A pause. Then a child's sleepy voice whispered into the line. Mom. The room spun. Lena slid down into a chair, every sound fading except her heartbeat. Where is she? Lena demanded, her voice shaking despite herself. The man chuckled softly. Safe. For now. The call ended. Alexander found Lena 10 minutes later. She was sitting perfectly still at the kitchen table, phone crushed in her hand. They took Emma, she said. Alexander's face hardened in a way his enemies never lived long enough to describe. Who knows about her? He asked. No one, Lena whispered. I erased that life. But someone hadn't. By noon, The message arrived at a single envelope delivered through 3 intermediaries. Inside, a photo of Emma eating breakfast, today's date, a location pin, and a note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Walk away from the Blackwoods. Disappear, or your daughter disappears permanently. Alexander slammed his fist into the desk. They want to isolate you, he said. They know I won't sacrifice my children. Lena stood. Her fear crystallized into something sharper. They're right, she said quietly. You can't. Alexander stepped closer. But I can help you get her back. Lena shook her head. That's what they want. War between families. Chaos. She met his eyes. This ends with me. That night, Lena left the estate without goodbye. No suitcase. No money. No protection. Only a burner phone and a plan. She followed the coordinates alone. An abandoned school on the edge of the city. Broken windows. Graffiti. Silence. Inside, the lights flickered on. Applause echoed. Well done, a familiar voice said. The guard. Alive. Uninjured. Smiling. You should have stayed a nanny, he continued. Instead, you became leverage. Lena didn't flinch. Where is my daughter? He gestured. A door opened. Emma stepped out. Unharmed. Confused, Lena forced herself not to run. Smart, the man said. Still thinking. He leaned closer. You want her back? You disappear. No Blackwood protection. No witnesses. Lena nodded slowly. I agree. The guard smiled. That was his mistake. Because Lena Hart had already decided. She wasn't leaving alone. And she wasn't leaving quietly. Lena nodded slowly. I agree, she said again. The guard relaxed. That was the second mistake. Because the moment Lena lowered her eyes, he assumed she was broken. She wasn't. She was calculating. Let the girl go, Lena said. I'll disappear. No police. No Blackwood. No noise. The guard laughed lightly. You think I trust you? No, Lena replied calmly. But you trust leverage. She reached into her jacket and placed the burner phone on the table. One call, she said, to prove I'm alone. The guard hesitated, then nodded. Go on. Lena dialed. Alexander answered instantly. They have Emma, Lena said, her voice flat. I'm cutting ties. Don't follow. Don't interfere. A pause. Then Alexander spoke only 3 words. I understand. Live. The call ended. The guard smiled. Smart man. He waved one of his men forward. Take the girl to the car. Emma ran to Lena, clinging to her leg. Lena knelt, smoothing her daughter's hair. Sweetheart, she whispered. Remember what mommy taught you. Emma nodded faintly. If anything scary happens, Lena continued softly. You don't scream. You count. Emma whispered, to 10. Lena kissed her forehead. The men let Emma out. The room fell quiet. Too quiet. The guard leaned against the desk, confident. You surprised me, he said. I thought you'd beg. Lena looked up. I already won. He frowned. What? She smiled. A real one. You never checked the phone. His eyes snapped to the burner. Too late. The explosion didn't come from inside the building. It came from outside. Tires screeched. Windows shattered. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Blackwood men flooded the compound like shadows with weapons. The guard spun, reaching for his gun. Lena was faster. She grabbed the fire extinguisher behind her and smashed it into his face. White powder exploded. He screamed. She didn't stop. She hit him again. And again. When he collapsed, coughing and blind, Lena stepped back. Alexander's men stormed in seconds later. Emma was already in Alexander's arms outside, unharmed. Alexander entered last. He looked at the guard on the floor. Then at Lena. You planned this, he said quietly. Lena wiped blood from her knuckles. They underestimated a mother, she replied. Alexander nodded. So did I. Later that night, Lena sat beside Emma in a safe house. The girl slept peacefully. Alexander stood by the window. They won't stop, he said. You know that now. Lena stood beside him. I know, she said. But neither will I. Alexander turned. There's no going back to a normal life, he said. Lena looked at her daughter, the future she'd almost lost. I stopped needing normal a long time ago. Alexander exhaled slowly. Then he extended his hand. Then stay, he said. Not as protection. Not as leverage. As family. Lena didn't answer immediately. She took his hand. And somewhere in the city, a final message was sent to every rival boss. Touch her again. Lose everything. The retaliation was swift. Not loud. Not public. Precise. Within 72 hours, the Salerno network collapsed from the inside. Accounts frozen. Safe houses raided. 2 insiders flipped. 1 disappeared before sunrise, and no announcements were made. But everyone in the underworld understood what had happened. Alexander Blackwood had stopped playing defense. And Lena Hart was the reason. On the 3rd night, Alexander returned to the estate alone. The triplets were asleep upstairs. Lena sat at the kitchen table, peeling apples the way she always did. Slow, careful, present. "They're finished," Alexander said quietly. Lena didn't look up. "Good." He watched her for a long moment. "You could leave now," he said. "No one would stop you." Lena finally met his eyes. "And run for the rest of my life?" she asked calmly. "No." She slid a slice of apple toward him. "They tried to break me by threatening my child," she continued. "They failed." Alexander nodded. "They underestimated you." "So did you," Lena said gently. "A beat." Then Alexander let out a breath that sounded like surrender. "Yes," he admitted. "I did." Later that week, the Blackwood triplets stood at the front gate, waving. A small backpack rested at Lena's feet. Emma held Lena's hand tightly. "Are we coming back?" Emma asked quietly. Lena crouched. "We're not leaving," she said. "We're choosing." Alexander stepped forward. He knelt in front of the children, something no one had ever seen him do. "Lena isn't your nanny," he said. "She isn't leaving." The boys stared. "She's family," Alexander finished. One of them stepped forward. "Forever." Lena swallowed. "Yes," she said. "Forever." They hugged her all at once. Messy. Fierce. Real. Alexander turned away so no one would see his eyes. Months later, the rumors changed. People no longer whispered about the Blackwood children being dangerous. They said they were untouchable. Protected by a woman who walked through gunfire for her daughter and stood unarmed between 3 broken boys and the world. Lena never carried a gun. She didn't need to. She carried something far more powerful. A reason. And in a city built on fear. That made her the most dangerous person of all.